Here's a question every NVIDIA investor should be asking right now. If your customers need help finding the money to buy your products, how strong is the demand really? NVIDIA has announced financing platforms with Apollo, BlackRock, Blackstone, Brookfield, Goldman Sachs, and KKR, designed to mobilize more than $500 billion for artificial intelligence infrastructure. That's an enormous amount of money, and it deserves a closer look. NVIDIA describes the idea as turning artificial intelligence computing power into something investors can finance as an asset class. In simple terms, giant data centers need extremely expensive chips, servers, buildings, electricity, cooling systems, and networking equipment. Instead of asking technology companies to pay for all of that themselves, NVIDIA and some of the biggest names in finance want to make much more outside capital available. And on the surface, that makes perfect sense. Imagine you own a profitable factory, but you need a new machine that costs $100,000. The machine could make you much more productive, but you don't have $100,000 sitting in your bank account. Somebody lends you the money, you buy the machine, your factory becomes more productive, and eventually the extra profits pay back the loan. Everybody wins. But now change one detail. Imagine the company selling you the machine is also helping you find the money to buy it. Maybe the seller lends you the cash. Maybe it guarantees your debt. Maybe it brings in a bank or an investment fund that finances the purchase. You receive the $100,000, you hand the $100,000 to the seller, and the seller records $100,000 of revenue. That sale is still real. This is important because the phrase circular financing can sound like somebody is accusing the company of inventing revenue. That isn't necessarily what's happening at all. The better question is whether the customer would have made the purchase without that financing. Financing can support healthy demand. It can also create additional demand that wouldn't exist if customers had to rely entirely on the cash generated by their own businesses. This is where the term vendor financing comes in. A vendor is simply the company selling the product. Vendor financing happens when the seller helps the customer finance the purchase. Circular financing is a broader idea. Money moves from suppliers, investors, lenders, or business partners toward the customer, and some of that money eventually comes back through purchases. Money leaves one side of the ecosystem and circles back as somebody else's revenue. Again, there's nothing automatically wrong with that. Car companies finance customers. Equipment manufacturers finance factories. Banks finance homes. Credit is one of the basic tools of modern capitalism. The problem begins when investors start treating finance demand exactly the same way as demand supported by strong cash generation. Those two things can look identical on an income statement while carrying very different levels of risk. Think about an artificial intelligence company spending billions on NVIDIA hardware. Investors see NVIDIA's sales growing. Fantastic! They see the customer placing even more orders for next year. Even better. Then they see a gigantic backlog representing future business. Champagne all around. But before opening the second bottle, somebody should ask where the customer is getting the money required to pay for all those chips. CoreWeave gives us a very useful example of why this question matters. The company recently lifted its projected 2026 capital spending to between $35 and $39 billion. At the same time, its second quarter revenue was about $2.58 billion, while its backlog reached an enormous $104.2 billion. Those numbers show incredible demand for computing capacity. They also show just how capital-intensive this business has become. And backlog deserves special attention. A backlog is basically business that customers have agreed to buy in the future. Investors love it because it provides some visibility into future revenue. But backlog isn't the same thing as cash sitting in the bank. The customer still needs to finance its spending. The infrastructure still needs to be built. And ultimately, somebody somewhere needs to generate enough real economic value to support the entire chain. That gives us three different ideas investors should keep separate. First, there is demand. Somebody wants the product. Second, there is financing. Somebody provides the money that allows the purchase to happen. Third, there is economically sustainable demand. That means the product eventually creates enough cash to justify what was spent on it. Wall Street has a charming habit of getting very excited about the first two and leaving the third one for another meeting. So how do you spot the risk? Start with a simple question. Where did the customer get the money? Look for investments made by suppliers into their own customers. Look for loans, guarantees, partnerships, and financing arrangements. Then compare revenue growth with free cash flow. Revenue tells you how much business a company is doing. Free cash flow gives you a much better idea of whether that business is actually producing cash after all the spending required to keep it running. Next, watch debt and customer concentration. If an artificial intelligence infrastructure company is borrowing enormous amounts of money while depending heavily on a small number of customers, the risks start connecting to each other. And if suppliers, customers, lenders, and investors all depend on continued expansion from the same small group of companies, trouble at one point in the chain can quickly travel through the rest of the system. The good version of this story is easy to understand. Companies borrow billions to build artificial intelligence infrastructure. Customers happily pay to use that computing power. Those customers make more money because artificial intelligence makes their businesses more productive. The infrastructure owners generate enough cash to repay their debt. They buy more NVIDIA chips. NVIDIA sells more hardware. The cycle continues because genuine economic value is being created. The bad version looks almost identical at the beginning. Companies borrow billions. They build data centers. NVIDIA sells mountains of chips. Revenue explodes, backlogs explode, share prices explode. Everybody writes research reports containing the phrase artificial intelligence supercycle. But if the final users of that computing power don't generate enough additional profit, the infrastructure owners eventually struggle to earn an adequate return. Then borrowing gets harder, expansion slows, and orders for new hardware can fall. And that's why the more than $500 billion NVIDIA hopes these financing platforms can mobilize is both exciting and something investors should watch carefully. Easier financing can dramatically accelerate artificial intelligence infrastructure construction. That could support NVIDIA's growth for years. But financing doesn't eliminate economic risk. It moves that risk around and spreads it among customers, lenders, investors, suppliers, and infrastructure owners. None of this proves NVIDIA is in trouble. It doesn't prove artificial intelligence demand is fake. And it certainly doesn't mean every finance data center is a bad investment. The lesson is much simpler. Never stop your research at the revenue number. When sales are growing incredibly quickly, ask what is funding that growth, and whether the customers doing all the spending are eventually producing enough cash to make the spending sustainable. That's the kind of question we try to focus on at NASDUCK, our Substack newsletter for ordinary investors who'd rather understand what's actually happening than stare at another chart with 17 colored lines on it. We cover the weekly market recap, investing tips and tricks, geopolitical scoops that could affect your portfolio, individual companies, market risks, and the strange financial machinery operating underneath the headlines. So the next time you hear that a company has record revenue, record orders, and a gigantic backlog, don't immediately ask how high the stock can go. Ask something more useful. Who is paying? Where did that money come from? How much of it was borrowed? And at the very end of the chain, who is generating the real cash that pays everybody back? Find that answer, and you're much closer to understanding whether you're looking at durable growth or a very expensive loop.